The morning of October the 23rd, 1942, Simpson Harbor, Rabaul, New Britain. 200 feet above the dark waters of the Pacific, Major William Benn leveled his B-17 Flying Fortress and stared through the cockpit windscreen at the silhouettes of Japanese warships anchored against the rising moon. The harbor was crowded. Intelligence had been right. 7 cargo ships, 2 destroyers, 1 cruiser, all sitting at anchor, resupplying before another convoy run to New Guinea. Benn pushed the throttles forward. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines roared. The bomber accelerated to 200 miles per hour, racing across the water at wave-top height toward a 7,000-ton cargo vessel. His bombardier, crouched in the glass nose, watched the distance close. 300 yards, 200 yards, 100 yards. Release! The 500-pound bomb dropped away from the aircraft, but it did not plunge straight down into the water. It fell at an angle, struck the surface, and bounced. Like a flat stone skipped across a pond. The bomb skipped once, twice, then slammed into the steel hull of the cargo ship at the waterline. The delayed fuse gave Benn 4 seconds. 4 seconds to climb away before the bomb sank beneath the surface and detonated underwater, blowing a hole in the ship's bottom. Behind him, the cargo vessel erupted in flame. Water rushed into the ruptured hull. The ship began to settle. Captain Kenneth McCullough, flying Benn's wing, released his bombs at a Japanese destroyer. Direct hit. The destroyer's stern lifted as the underwater explosion tore through the engineering spaces. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was the first combat use of skip bombing by American forces in the Pacific War, October the 23rd, 1942. A night that would change naval warfare. A tactic that would sink hundreds of Japanese ships over the next 3 years. A method so devastatingly effective that Japan would abandon the use of large convoys entirely, strangling their ability to reinforce positions across the Pacific. But the story of skip bombing is not the story of one pilot having a sudden, brilliant idea. It is not the story of a single B-25 skipping bombs into a Japanese ship and inventing an entire attack method. It is something far more complex, far more human, and far more revealing about how innovation actually happens in war. It is the story of frustrated officers watching bombs miss their targets 99 times out of 100. It is the story of a general willing to ignore regulations and let his men experiment. It is the story of pilots practicing for months against a wrecked freighter in Port Moresby Harbor, learning through trial and error what altitude worked, what speed worked, what fuse delay kept the bomb from exploding too soon or sinking too deep. It is the story of modified Australian fuses because American supply chains could not deliver the right equipment. It is the story of mechanics scavenging parts from wrecked aircraft to install guns that were never authorized. It is the story of B-17 pilots flying at altitudes that made them perfect targets because they lacked the forward-firing guns to suppress enemy anti-aircraft fire. So they attacked at night when the Japanese could not see them clearly. And it is the story of Major William Benn, who perfected this tactic, who led it into combat, who proved it worked, and who died 3 months later when his B-25 crashed into the mountains of New Guinea on a routine reconnaissance flight. His wreckage would not be found for 55 years. The problem began in early 1942 when American bomber crews in the Southwest Pacific discovered that nothing they had been trained to do actually worked against Japanese shipping. High-altitude bombing, the doctrine that dominated American Air Force thinking, was spectacularly ineffective against moving ships. A B-17 Flying Fortress bombing from 25,000 feet might as well have been dropping its payload into the ocean randomly. The bombs took nearly 30 seconds to fall from that altitude. 30 seconds during which a ship traveling at 12 knots moved more than 600 feet. The bombardier aimed at where the ship was. The bomb arrived at where the ship had been. The statistics were damning. In the first 6 months of 1942, B-17s of the 19th Bomb Group dropped hundreds of bombs on Japanese convoys. Less than 1% hit their targets. 1%. 99 out of every 100 bombs fell harmlessly into the sea, wasting ordnance, wasting fuel, wasting time, while Japanese transports delivered troops and supplies to bases across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant General George Kenney arrived in Australia in July 1942 to take command of the 5th Air Force. He inherited a disaster. 75 operational fighters for the entire theatre, hundreds of wrecked aircraft piled up at salvage yards, demoralized pilots, failed tactics. The Japanese controlled most of the Southwest Pacific. American forces were barely holding on. Kenney was 53 years old. He had been flying since World War I. He had taught attack aviation at the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s, when most officers dismissed low-level bombing as too dangerous and ineffective. He had written the developmental requirements for attack aircraft. He had experimented with unconventional tactics. He was one of the few senior officers in the Army Air Force who believed that air power used creatively could win wars. On the flight to Australia, Kenney and his aide, Major William Benn, discussed the problem of attacking ships. Ben was 42 years old. He had been in the military since 1917. He was a natural innovator, the kind of officer who questioned doctrine when doctrine did not work. They talked about skip bombing. The British had tried it in the early years of the war, attacking German ships at very low altitude and releasing bombs that would skip across the water like stones. The British had abandoned the technique as too dangerous. Aircraft flying at 200 feet were easy targets for shipboard anti-aircraft guns. The casualty rates were unacceptable, but Kenney thought it might work in the Pacific if executed differently. If bombers attacked at night, when anti-aircraft gunners could not see them clearly, if they used delayed fuses, so the bombs would sink before exploding, detonating below the waterline, where damage was most effective, if they approached fast enough that ships had no time to maneuver. When Kenney's aircraft stopped to refuel at Nadi in the Fiji Islands, he and Ben borrowed a B-26 Marauder, loaded it with practice bombs and flew out over the ocean. They dropped bombs from low altitude, watching them skip across the surface, testing angles and speeds. The concept seemed viable, difficult, dangerous, but viable. When Kenney arrived at his headquarters in Brisbane, Australia, he reviewed the operational reports. The 19th and 43rd Bomb Groups had been flying missions against Japanese positions at Rabaul, the major enemy base on New Britain. Rabaul's Simpson Harbor was one of the largest natural harbors in the Pacific. The Japanese had turned it into their primary forward base. Hundreds of aircraft on 5 airfields, dozens of ships in the harbor at any given time. American bombers had been attacking Rabaul since February 1942. Small raids, usually at night, to avoid Japanese fighters. 3 or 4 B-17s would fly 600 miles from their base near Townsville to Port Moresby, refuel, grab a few hours of sleep on the wings of their aircraft, or under them if it rained, then fly another 400 miles across the Owen Stanley Mountains and the Bismarck Sea to Rabaul. The raids were achieving almost nothing. High-altitude bombing missed. Medium-altitude bombing missed. The Japanese ships maneuvered. The Japanese fighters rose to meet the bombers. American casualties mounted while Japanese operations continued undisturbed. Kenney made a decision. He removed Major Ben from his staff and placed him in command of the 63rd Bomb Squadron, part of the 43rd Bomb Group. He gave Ben full authority to develop low-altitude skip bombing tactics. No bureaucratic approval required. No engineering studies from Wright Field in Ohio. No 6-month testing programs. Just results. Ben understood what this meant. If skip bombing worked, it could change the war. If it failed, he would be responsible for the deaths of his pilots, flying bombers into point-blank range of Japanese guns with no way to suppress defensive fire. He selected his pilots carefully. First Lieutenant James Murphy, Captain Kenneth McCullough, Lieutenant Fulmer. Sogard, called the Swede by everyone in the squadron. Captain Ed Scott, Lieutenant Glenn Lewis, men who were willing to experiment, men who were good enough to survive the learning process. They began practicing in September 1942 against the wreck of the SS Pruth, an old freighter that had run aground on a reef just outside Port Moresby Harbour during a storm in January 1924. The Pruth sat there, partially submerged, a perfect stationary target for bomber crews learning a new tactic. The first attempts were failures. Ben started by dropping bombs from 50 feet altitude, the height the British had used. The bombs bounced back at the aircraft. Too low. The bomber almost flew into its own ordnance. They tried 100 feet. Better, but the bombs still bounced unpredictably, sometimes skipping past the target, sometimes sinking immediately without skipping at all. They tried 200 feet, 250 feet. They experimented with different speeds, 180 miles per hour, 200 miles per hour, 230 miles per hour. They tested different release points, 60 feet from the target, 100 feet, 300 feet. The bombs themselves were a problem. They were using Australian-manufactured fuses because American supplies had not arrived. The Australian fuses were supposed to have 10 to 12-second delays. In practice, they were wildly inconsistent, sometimes detonating in 3 seconds, sometimes in 30 seconds, sometimes not detonating at all. A 3-second delay meant the bomb exploded while the aircraft was still directly overhead, catastrophic. A 30-second delay meant the bomb sank too deep and the underwater explosion lacked the focused hydrostatic shock that made skip bombing effective. Ben requisitioned proper American 5-second delay fuses. The supply chain promised delivery in 6 months. He ignored the promise and kept using the unreliable Australian fuses, training his pilots to fly as if every bomb might detonate early. Slowly, through hundreds of practice runs, patterns emerged. The optimal altitude was 200 to 250 feet. The optimal speed was 200 to 250 miles per hour. The optimal release point was approximately 300 yards from the target, giving the bomb time to skip once or twice before impact. But there was another problem, far more serious than fuse delays or release points. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the only aircraft with sufficient range to reach Rabaul from Port Moresby, had minimal forward-firing armament, just 2 50-caliber machine guns in the nose, fired by the bombardier, not enough to suppress the anti-aircraft guns on Japanese ships. A destroyer approaching at low level faced point-blank fire from 20mm cannons, 25mm machine guns, and in some cases, the main deck guns depressed to their minimum angles. The Japanese gunners could see the bomber coming from miles away. They had time to aim. They had time to calculate the lead. They had overwhelming firepower. American bombers attacking at medium or high altitude could at least rely on distance and altitude to reduce the accuracy of anti-aircraft fire. Bombers attacking at 200 feet had no such protection. They flew directly into the guns. If those guns were operational, if the crews were alert, the bomber had little chance of survival. Ben's solution was simple and terrifying. Attack at night, use the moon for illumination. Approach from the east, with the moon behind the bomber, silhouetting the ships against the moonlight while keeping the aircraft in relative darkness. Attack fast, attack low, release bombs, climb away before the Japanese gunners could track the bomber effectively in the darkness. It was not a perfect solution. Night navigation over the Pacific was difficult, finding the target was difficult. Judging altitude over water in darkness was nearly impossible without instruments. But it was the only solution that gave the bombers a chance against ships with fully operational defenses. By mid-October 1942, Ben believed his squadron was ready. They had practiced enough. They understood the technique. They knew the risks. Intelligence reported heavy shipping in Simpson Harbor, 15 cargo ships, multiple destroyers, cruisers, the largest concentration of Japanese vessels seen in weeks. Kenny approved the mission. Ben selected crews for the first combat test of skip bombing. 3 flights, 9 aircraft total, all volunteers. They would attack on the night of October the 22nd, targeting ships in Rabaul Harbor. The briefing was held at Port Moresby. Ben emphasized surprise. The Japanese had no reason to expect low-level night attack. Their anti-aircraft defenses were positioned for high-altitude bombers. Their fighters lacked effective night capability. The greatest danger was not enemy fire. But the mountains. The Owen Stanley Range rose to 13,000 feet between Port Moresby and Rabaul. The bombers would cross those mountains in darkness, navigate across the Bismarck Sea, then descend to attack altitude. While approaching the target, navigation errors could be fatal, weather could be fatal. Engine failures over the ocean meant ditching in darkness with almost no chance of rescue. The crews understood. They had all been flying combat missions since the beginning of the war. They had all lost friends. They knew the statistics. They knew that high-altitude bombing was not working. They knew that something had to change, or the Japanese would keep reinforcing their positions and the Allies would keep losing ground. October the 22nd, 1942, late afternoon, 9 B-17 Flying Fortresses departed Port Moresby and climbed toward the Owen Stanley Mountains. They flew in loose formation, maintaining radio silence. The sun set behind them as they crossed the mountains. Ahead, the Bismarck Sea stretched dark and empty under the rising moon. They descended to 2,000 feet for the transit across the open water. Lower was safer from detection, but fuel consumption increased dramatically at low altitude. The B-17s burned through fuel faster than Ben had calculated. They would be cutting it close on the return flight. At 10:30 p.m., the coast of New Britain appeared ahead. The bombers descended further, dropping to 500 feet, then 200 feet, racing across the dark water towards Simpson Harbor. The moon had risen enough to silhouette the harbor's landmarks, Vunakanau and Lakunai airfields, visible by their perimeter lights. The town of Rabaul itself, blacked out, but identifiable by its location. And Simpson Harbor, filled with ships. Ben counted quickly. More than intelligence had reported. Not 15 ships, at least 20, cargo vessels, destroyers, one heavy cruiser, submarines alongside the docks, a target-rich environment. The first flight approached from the east. Moonlight behind them, ships silhouetted against the lighter water. Ben selected his target, a large cargo vessel, probably 7,000 tons, moored near the center of the harbor. He pushed the throttles forward. The B-17 accelerated, 220 miles per hour, altitude 200 feet. The ship grew larger in his windscreen. The Japanese spotted them too late. Anti-aircraft tracers arced up from the ships, bright red streaks cutting through the darkness, but the gunners were firing blind, tracking sound more than sight. The tracers passed harmlessly behind Ben's bomber. 300 yards. The bombardier called release. The bomb fell away. Ben pulled back on the control column. The B-17 climbed steeply, engines roaring. Behind him, the bomb struck the water, skipped twice, and slammed into the cargo ship's hull at the waterline. 4 seconds later, the delayed fuse triggered. The underwater explosion blew a massive hole in the ship's bottom. Water rushed in. The cargo vessel began to list. Captain McCullough attacked a destroyer. His bomb hit perfectly, penetrating the thin hull and exploding in the engineering spaces. The destroyer lost power. Captain Franklin Green targeted another cargo ship. Direct hit. The ship caught fire. The entire attack lasted less than 10 minutes. 9 B-17s releasing bombs. Japanese anti-aircraft fire increasing as the gun crews realized what was happening, but most of the shots going wide in the darkness. The American bombers climbed away, reformed, and turned east toward Port Moresby. They flew back across the Bismarck Sea at low altitude, engines straining, fuel gauges dropping toward empty. Several aircraft had to shut down one engine to conserve fuel. They barely made it back to Port Moresby, landing with tanks nearly dry. The crews climbed out of their aircraft exhausted but exhilarated. The tactic had worked. They had attacked Japanese ships at close range and survived. They had scored multiple hits. They believed they had sunk at least 3 ships, possibly more. The intelligence reports that came back later were less optimistic. Japanese records showed that no ships were actually sunk that night. Several were damaged. One destroyer was hit hard enough to require return to Japan for repairs. 2 cargo ships were damaged, but remained operational. The attack had hurt the Japanese, but it had not been the devastating success the crews believed. Ben was not discouraged. The tactic worked. The bombs had skipped correctly. The delayed fuses had mostly functioned. The surprise had been complete. The Japanese had not expected low-level attack, and their defenses had been ineffective in darkness. He scheduled another mission for October the 24th. This time, the results were similar. Hits claimed, damage inflicted, but no confirmed sinkings. Post-war evaluation of Japanese records would show that skip bombing with B-17s in October and early November 1942 damaged approximately 30 Japanese vessels, but sank none outright. The problem was clear. The B-17s lacked the forward-firing armament to suppress shipboard defenses. Even attacking at night, the bombers were vulnerable during the final approach. The bombardiers could not aim effectively while also manning the nose guns. The pilots could not judge distance and altitude precisely while flying at high speed in darkness over water. Kenny understood. Skip bombing worked as a concept, but the B-17 was the wrong aircraft. It was too large, too slow, too lightly armed for low-level attack. He needed something smaller, faster, more maneuverable, something with enough forward-firing guns to clear the decks of enemy ships before releasing bombs. He needed the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, and he needed someone to modify it with enough firepower to make skip bombing truly devastating. He had exactly the man for that job, a 42-year-old former Navy pilot named Paul Gunn, called Pappy by everyone who knew him. Gunn had been modifying aircraft without authorization since August, installing scavenged 50-caliber machine guns from wrecked fighters into the noses of A-20 light bombers. Kenny called Gunn to his office in November 1942. He told him to take 12 B-25 Mitchell bombers and convert them into strafers, remove the bombardier, remove the bomb sight, fill the nose with as many 50-caliber machine guns as physically possible, add guns to the fuselage, turn the medium bomber into a ship-killing weapon that could suppress all defensive fire while skip bombing at masthead height. Gunn said it would work, but there would be serious engineering problems. Adding 8 50-caliber guns to the nose would shift the center of gravity forward. The aircraft would be nose-heavy. Handling would change. Pilots would need retraining. And there was the matter of regulations. The B-25 was built by North American Aviation, under contract to the Army Air Force. Any modification required approval from both the manufacturer and the engineering command at Wright Field. That approval could take a year. Kenny told Gunn to ignore the regulations. They were at war. American pilots were dying. If Gunn's modifications saved lives and killed Japanese, that was all that mattered. Official approval could come later. Gunn went to work. By February 1st, 1943, 12 B-25 strafers were complete. 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in the nose, 2 on each side of the fuselage. Enough firepower to put out 6,800 rounds per minute, enough to shred the superstructure of any ship, kill every exposed crew member, destroy every anti-aircraft gun. Combined with skip bombing, it would be devastatingly effective. But William Benn would not live to see it. On January 18th, 1943, less than 3 months after leading the first skip bombing attack on Rabaul, Benn took off from Port Moresby in a B-25 on a reconnaissance flight over the north coast of New Guinea. The mission was routine: find clearings in the jungle that could serve as emergency landing zones for damaged aircraft. The B-25 never returned. No distress call, no wreckage spotted. The aircraft simply disappeared. Search planes flew the estimated route. They found nothing. Benn and his entire crew were listed as missing in action. It would be 55 years before anyone discovered what happened. In 1998, an American businessman named Fred Hagen, searching for his great-uncle's aircraft, found the wreckage of a B-25 high in the Owens Stanley Range. The aircraft had lost its left engine and crashed into the mountains. Benn's B-25. His body was never positively identified, but DNA testing eventually confirmed the remains of his co-pilot, Major Don Young. William Benn was 42 years old when he died. He had perfected skip bombing. He had led it into combat. He had proven it worked. General Kenny would later write in his memoirs that no one in the Pacific Theater made a greater contribution to victory than Bill Benn. But Benn died before the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He died before skip bombing, combined with Pappy guns' strafer modifications, proved truly devastating. He died before the tactic he developed sank hundreds of Japanese ships and strangled Japan's ability to reinforce its positions. The story continues without him. February 28th, 1943. A Japanese convoy departed Rabaul. 8 transport ships carrying 6,900 troops, 8 destroyers as escorts, approximately 100 fighter aircraft providing air cover. The largest convoy Japan had sent to New Guinea in months. Allied intelligence knew about it immediately. Radio intercepts, decoded in Melbourne and Washington, revealed the convoy's destination and schedule. It was heading for Lae, a Japanese base on the north coast of New Guinea. If those troops reached Lae, they would tip the balance in the ground fighting. The Allies could not allow that. Kenny ordered a maximum effort. Every available aircraft, B-17s for medium-altitude bombing, Australian Beaufighters for strafing, A-20 light bombers for skip bombing, and the newly modified B-25 strafers for the killing blow. This would be their first combat test. Everything depended on whether Pappy guns' modifications actually worked in combat. March 3rd, 1943, dawn broke over the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese convoy had turned south through Vitiaz Strait during the night, entering Huon Gulf. They were 80 miles from Lae, close enough that some commanders believed they might reach the safety of shore-based anti-aircraft batteries before the Americans could mount a coordinated attack. They were wrong. At 9:45 a.m., the first Allied aircraft appeared. 13 Australian Beaufighters swept in at 50 feet above the waves, 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns per aircraft. They opened fire at 500 yards. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Japanese. The cannons tore through the superstructures of the destroyers. They killed officers on bridges. They destroyed fire control systems. They shredded anti-aircraft gun crews before those crews could return effective fire. The Japanese destroyers tried to shoot back, but their guns could not depress low enough to hit aircraft flying at wavetop height. The Beaufighters made 2 passes, suppressing the convoy's defenses, then climbed away. Now came the strafer B-25s, 12 aircraft in 4 flights of 3. Major Edward Lana led the first flight. They approached from the east with the morning sun behind them. Altitude 250 feet, speed 260 miles per hour. The Japanese spotted them too late. The strafer B-25s were smaller and faster than B-17s. They looked almost like fighters until they were close enough to see the guns. At 1,000 yards, Lana opened fire. 8 50-caliber machine guns hammered simultaneously. The sound was deafening even inside the cockpit. Tracers reached out toward the nearest transport ship, a 6,000-ton cargo vessel loaded with troops and supplies. The other 2 B-25s in his flight opened fire. 24 machine guns firing at one ship. The combined firepower was devastating, beyond anything the Japanese had experienced. The 50-caliber rounds tore through the transport's superstructure like it was made of paper. Bridge windows exploded. The wheelhouse disintegrated. Gun crews died at their stations, cut down before they could return fire. The transport lost steering control within the first 3 seconds of the attack. At 300 yards, Lana released his bombs, 2 500-pound bombs with 4-second delayed fuses. He pulled back on the control column and climbed away, banking hard left to clear the target area. Behind him, the bombs fell away, tumbled, briefly, then stabilized and skipped across the water surface. They hit the water approximately 100 yards from the target ship, bounced once, bounced twice, then struck the hull at the waterline, traveling at over 200 miles per hour. The momentum carried them through the thin hull, plating into the cargo holds and troop compartments. 4 seconds later, they exploded. The blast occurred inside the hull. The transport broke in half. The explosion blew out the bottom of the ship. Water rushed in. The forward section lifted to starboard and started to sink. The aft section rolled to port. Troops trapped below decks had no chance. The ship went down in less than 3 minutes. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers were dragged under. Total time, from opening fire to climbing away, was 18 seconds. The transport was doomed. Lana's wingmen attacked 2 more transports in the same formation. Captain Robert Strickland hit the second transport with devastating effect. His bombs penetrated the engine room. The explosion destroyed the boilers. Steam filled the compartments, killing everyone inside. The ship lost all power and started taking on water. Lieutenant Donald Mitchell attacked the third transport. His machine gun fire killed the bridge crew and destroyed the steering. His bombs hit amidships, blowing a hole in the hull 20 feet across. The transport began settling by the stern. 3 transports sinking. The organized convoy dissolving into chaos. And the attack was not over. The second, third, and fourth flights of B-25s attacked the remaining ships. The pattern was the same every time. Low altitude approach at high speed. Devastating. Machine gun fire suppressing all defenses. Skip bombing with delayed fuse bombs penetrating deep into the hulls before exploding. One after another, the Japanese transports were destroyed. By the time the last B-25 pulled away, the convoy had become a debris field of burning, sinking, exploding ships. The entire attack wave lasted 14 minutes. In that time, the Allies sank or mortally damaged 12 ships. All 12 Strafer B-25s returned to base. Minor damage on 3 aircraft. No casualties. Follow-up attacks continued on March 4th. A-20s and Beaufighters attacked survivors in the water and rescue ships trying to pick them up. This was controversial then and remains controversial now. The attacking pilots and commanders defended the decision. Any Japanese soldier who reached shore would join enemy forces. The battle was not over until the enemy could no longer fight. Of the 6,900 troops that left Rabaul, approximately 1,200 reached Leh. Another 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabaul. The rest, approximately 3,000 men, were killed. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, 2 destroyers damaged. Japan never again attempted to send a large convoy through waters controlled by Allied aircraft. The supply line to New Guinea was cut. Japanese garrisons withered without reinforcement. The strategic initiative in the Southwest Pacific shifted permanently to the Allies, but none of that would have been possible without the tactic William Benn developed. The Strafer B-25s delivered the killing blows that sank the convoy, but they were using skip bombing, Benn's skip bombing. The technique he perfected through months of practice against the wreck of the Pruth in Port Moresby Harbor. The technique he led into combat for the first time in October 1942. The technique that proved modern naval warfare had changed forever. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The official histories do not emphasize Benn's contribution as much as they should. General Kenny receives credit for developing skip bombing doctrine. Pappy Gunn receives credit for the Strafer modifications. The pilots of the 90th Bomb Squadron receive credit for the execution at Bismarck Sea. All of them deserved that credit. Kenny authorized the development. Gunn created the weapon. The pilots executed the mission. But Benn did the unglamorous work. The months of practice runs, the experimentation with altitudes and speeds and release points, the combat testing under the worst possible conditions, flying B-17s at night against defended targets with inadequate armament. He developed skip bombing from a theoretical concept into a practical combat tactic. He trained the first pilots. He led the first missions. He proved it worked. And he died before seeing the full impact of what he had created. That is how innovation actually happens in war. Not through brilliant individuals having sudden insights, but through patient experimentation, through officers willing to ignore regulations and let their men try new approaches, through mechanics scavenging parts from wrecked aircraft to build weapons that were never officially authorized, through pilots risking their lives to test tactics that might not work. Skip bombing was not invented by one B-25 pilot in a single mission. It was developed by dozens of men over months of work. Some of them, like Benn, died before the tactic reached its full potential. Some of them, like gun, survived and continued innovating throughout the war. Some of them, like Lana, executed the missions that proved the concept decisively. All of them contributed. All of them mattered. The story is not simpler or more dramatic because we focus on one person. It is richer and more truthful because we acknowledge the complexity. William Benn is buried at Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines. His grave marker lists his rank as Major, United States Army Air Forces. It notes his Distinguished Service Cross and his Distinguished Service Medal, both awarded for his development of low-altitude bombing tactics. It does not mention that his wreckage sat undiscovered in the mountains of New Guinea for 55 years. It does not mention that his family spent decades not knowing what happened to him. The B-25 strafers continued to devastate Japanese forces throughout the Pacific War. They destroyed shipping, obliterated airfields, annihilated ground positions. At WWII, in August 1943, strafer B-25s destroyed 174 Japanese aircraft on the ground in a single raid. At Hollandia, in March 1944, they destroyed 400 aircraft. The Japanese never recovered air superiority in New Guinea. Skip bombing, combined with strafer modifications, had fundamentally altered the balance of power. Ships were no longer safe in open water. Convoys could not reinforce isolated garrisons. The logistics that enabled Japanese expansion collapsed. Wars are not won by courage alone. They are not won by superior tactics or better training. They are won by innovation, by the ability to adapt faster than the enemy, by officers willing to try approaches that doctrine says are impossible, by mechanics willing to build weapons that regulations say are unauthorized, by pilots willing to test tactics that might get them killed. William Benn understood that. George Kenney understood that. Pappy Gunn understood that. The men who flew those missions understood that. They changed how wars were fought, one skip-bombed ship at a time, one modification at a time, one mission at a time, until the cumulative effect became overwhelming and irreversible. The title asks about one B-25 pilot skipping bombs into a Japanese ship and starting an entire new attack method. The truth is more complicated and more remarkable. It was dozens of pilots, mechanics, and commanders working together over months, developing a tactic that would sink hundreds of ships and help win the Pacific War. That complexity does not diminish the achievement. It reveals what Chile innovation looks like when lives depend on getting it right. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.